there's been a series of interviews, and this is just one in that series of exploring culture from the perspective of different experts. And I'm really pleased to say that today's expert is actually in human rights and focusing attention on workers' rights. So Alessa Rigal, welcome. So focusing on a humanitarian approach, Alessa has worked in workers' rights and international development spaces over the last 12 years. Since arriving to the UK from California, she has built her career through roles within international NGOs, international development consultancies and ethical auditing, leading her to a current role within a global produce company. In that time, she has most notably spent 5 years with the Ethical Trading Initiative, working closely with companies, trade unions and NGOs. For those of you who don't know, NGOs are non-government organisations. She collaborated on programs focused on improvement of workers' rights in global supply chains, initially across apparel and food, and then exclusively in agriculture. Her work in agriculture over the last 6 years has been focused addressing needs of vulnerable worker groups. And as the group head of human rights and ethics within a newly created sustainability team, she now has the opportunity to apply over a decade of experience into creating a strategic human rights plans paired with an ambitious sustainability agenda for her company, while contributing toward change and addressing workers' rights more widely across the agricultural industry. That's an amazing, impressive journey, if I can put it that way, Alessa. You've done so much and so focused as well. So let's get right into it, right? So what is it about? What is human rights about? We hear about it on TV, in the public domain, people have views about it, but give us an inside view, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, first of all, thanks very much for having me. So I think when people think about human rights, I think often they think about general kind of per se things like pursuit of happiness, but also things like how are you protected at work, what sort of expectations you can have. For me, the draw of getting into human rights was really kind of from time at university and always wanting to be in a space of wanting to protect and look after the treatment of people. And my first role when I first came to the UK was working with the British Red Cross with newly arrived asylum seekers. And I didn't really know where I was going with that role and in my career, but I knew that being in that humanitarian space is somewhere that I wanted to focus more exclusively. And in that now actually getting on almost 13 years of being in this country, I've really taken a focus in my career of looking at how that protection and support can take place, not only through my actions that I'm doing, but also within the organizations that I've been working in, and how that human rights approach can be applied regardless as to what sort of position that you're in.
Wow. Okay. That's a bit of a calling, isn't it? I mean, it sounds like, as you've evolved or explored that, it's become a bit of a calling for you, that, you're really focused on this within the industry you're in right now. So how does then human rights translate in the workplace then? What does that look like in practice?
Yeah, so I think when we think about workers' rights more specifically in relation to human rights, it's looking at things more specifically around protections and expectations that one should have whilst at work, that you're going to be safe, that you're going to be treated fairly, that you're going to maintain dignity while you're in that role. And that applies to everybody, from those who are picking our food and making our clothes, to those who are in the shops that we visit, and also to ourselves in each of the roles that we have. It's not just something that happens over there, but it's just as much applies to you as to those further afield.
And I suppose in today's context, we can't ignore where we are today in the world, with the pandemic, with Black Lives Matter, with the emphasis on a different way of working, on inclusion, in belonging. All of those things are really, really sort of changing the world, the way we see the view. Well, is it our place in the world? I don't know, but I go deep, don't I? So there's something about the world today and the implications for that in the workplace today as well. Do you find there's impacts or changes? Do you have a view on that?
I think the way, you know, especially within the kind of ethical trade specifically space of looking at the kind of protections and support of workers and what that means has evolved quite a lot in the kind of last 20 to 30 years. And what you would initially have thought of the kind of exploitative conditions of the Nike factories back in the 90s and where we are today. I think it's come leaps and bounds. Obviously, I'm employed in what I do, so it's very much still a problem. It has gotten better, but things like you know, expectations and regulation with reporting, and also just public awareness and expectations is helping to shift that kind of approach. And I think particularly with you know, a pandemic world that we now live in, paired with the kind of rising momentum again of Black Lives Matters, I think it's trying to really see how the current model of working isn't fit for purpose anymore. And what needs to evolve. So the idea of things quite simply, such as flexible working, and that being an acknowledgement that that needs to be in place for everybody. It's not just those with family commitments, but, you know, taking into account things like mental health and just general work-life balance, that flexible approach of not needing to be sitting physically in an office from 9 to 5. And the world has now seen, for those who were able to, because I appreciate that was a privilege, that not every job was able to be at home, that the world has carried on. You don't have to physically be in an office to be able to do what's going on where that your job allows you to. So I think the kind of growing dynamics of where we are and the focus and momentum that movements have gotten at just now, I think has been very much dramatically facilitated by the pandemic, by being at home, by having that space and time to be able to actually take on everything that's around you, that will hopefully, you know, it's already starting to translate into changes, and hopefully that wasn't short-lived, and that will continue, but it's only going to continue if we all keep taking our role in that space, and not just within a work environment, but I think more generally.
It's interesting what you've just said, because what comes to mind is there is almost this idea that we will go back to normal. You know, even the government, you hear the government making comments about going back to normal, and some leaders might be saying going back to normal. You know, I can't talk for all companies, but certainly the ones I've heard, there is this sense that what does normal look like now? And, you know, I keep thinking that actually we are already in the new normal. This is the normal. This is where we have to adapt and so on. So hopefully, you know, organizations are doing that. And so I see it as an opportunity. And actually, just going back to something you said about regulatory reporting and so on. So there's something about taking workers' rights seriously doesn't just come from human rights, but is actually embedded within the corporate governance code. So you know, those of us who are familiar with the corporate governance code, it actually says, and I'll just read this out to you, it's a principle in the corporate governance code from 2018 that the workforce should be able to raise any matters of concern in confidence and anonymously for review by the board. And, you know, there's something about that that's really, you know, there's huge implications for that, don't you think?
Totally, and I think whilst on paper that's what's written, I think unfortunately I would say it's a bit more implied rather than embedded. I think we've got some companies are taking more of a lead in that space, but I think there's a lot within the kind of wider environmental, social, and governance space that is growing in momentum, and those who are leading will have acknowledged that's where the next direction of travel is. So they're putting their heads above the parapet and starting to take that on, whilst many companies are still just kind of waiting for that previous normal to come back. So I think you're going to start to see that defined shift there of who's taking that on and who's waiting and hoping for it to go back to what it was.
Yeah. So actually, it's more about what is the opportunity now to actually improve the way we do things, the way we listen to our workforce, the way we actually pay attention. We hear what's being said, and we listen to that and we can act on it as well. But that goes all the way to the very top of the organization if they're paying attention. So it moves away from that assumptions, the old assumptions we had around the ways of working.
Yeah, and I think, you know, things around, so within corporate governance, I think, you know, what it wants companies to do is to operate in a judicious way with their resources, and obviously one of those main resources is their workforce.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth noting that often, you know, an organization that has strong corporate governance is much more likely to be strong in addressing human rights because of the culture of accountability that is being created in adopting that code, that it brings about that accountability being embedded, and that it's encouraging to round those discussions on how to operate in a better corporate system. So interestingly, actually, my fiance works in corporate governance, and so it sparked a number of conversations, some where we totally align and some where we friendly disagree, as you can imagine. So we were talking more about that in relation to kind of its links between governance and human rights. And I think what we came to the conclusion of is see it, initially he had said they're kind of brother and sister. And I'm like, well, I think they're more actually like cousins who aren't quite close yet, but they're growing in that relationship. And I think, you know, today a lot of boards are being tasked with looking at the governance agenda, and being that they're the ultimate stewards of the company, they're starting to take an increased focus on human rights. That kind of S of ESG is really trying to shine a little bit more than others. And, you know, things like better diversity in the workplace and at the board are social points where, you know, there's a lot of research to show that leads to things like better financial performance and strength in the board and company, and they're all interlinked. And I think a strong and holistic approach that a company could have really is what drives change. And that the private sector, I think, has a massive opportunity and a monumental role in being able to play a force of good, and they're able to foster change in a society whilst growing financially and successfully as a company. I think so many companies often think like, I have to do this little kind of philanthropic project on the side, or I've got to focus all my attention on you know, growing my business. But there's such a space here in the middle where those two things can work simultaneously.
Yes.
That's where I think the opportunities are growing, of the companies who've understood that you can grow your business financially and be leading in your space, and also be doing good for society, and not in a tokenistic gesture, but actually genuinely contributing to both the lives of your own employees, but also if your company is working within a supply chain space, that the actions that you're taking for your company are actually contributing towards helping people rather than harming people.
Yes, that's amazing. I really like this idea that everything's interlinked with it, you know, that actually if you fundamentally addressed the point of workers' rights, listening to your workers, listening to the workforce voice, listening in a way that's meaningful, you actually meet quite a number of different agendas, right? So that's what I'm hearing from you, that there's a number. You want financial performance, let's address this. You want high productivity, let's address this. If you want to create inclusion, let's address this. So it's almost like an underlying theme across everything that we do in an organization. Get this right, and you're far ahead of the game, I think. That's
but exactly, and to you and I, that sounds like absolute common sense, but here we are. It's just something that's so often ignored, that, you know, that they're at the heart of your business. So if you're not focusing on what you're doing within the employees and the workers that are connected to you, then how can you expect to continue to have a business? In my case, working within a produce company, if we don't protect the environment where food is being grown, and we don't look after the workers who are picking it, we have no business.
Yes.
It's that applies across the board, but very, very fundamentally, if you don't have a workforce and you don't have the land to grow the food, then, you know, it's not going to carry on, and that has monumental implications across the board. Obviously, food security is a huge thing that is always on the back of everybody's mind, paired with the likes of climate change and generally kind of access to labor. It's a whole big conversation that has focus in different areas depending on what country you're looking at it in, but the same kind of principles apply, that interlinked point around kind of within a company and its board and all that different stuff, I think you can say that about everything. I mean, the conversation and what is happening in the world with regards to climate change is absolutely connected to everything that people are doing. And I think still, despite kind of the growing resources and news and everything else that's going on, people still don't seem to see the link. I mean, as you mentioned in my bio, I'm from California, which is currently on fire. And whilst that is something that happens each year, as it does in a lot of places, the depth and number of fires that are going on at present is never been seen before. And you've seen that and various other examples around the world, paired with then how does that affect the people in those spaces? How does that affect any sort of work that's going on? California is also, incredibly agriculture focused. What's going on in that? There's all those links are all together. And I think until people start to recognize that when you're looking at addressing a problem, you have to look at that holistic, bigger picture, then we're just putting a plaster on what's going on, because whilst you fixed this thing, then this has gone out of control, and then you fix this one, and then that's got out of control. So, when are we going to start listening to kind of the experts out there who are saying that we've got to take steps to doing that now, because if we keep putting it off for later, then there's not going to be anything left.
So that speaks to quite some challenges, I suppose. That speaks to some challenges that leaders face when you're thinking about complexity. So the bigger the organization, the wider the supply chain, the more geographical spread of operations and production, and depending on where you are in the world as well, it calls to this complexity, right? So actually there's quite a nuanced solution that you're talking about. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I think there's, you're able to, I'm obviously speaking quite broadly, but I think the principles are there of whatever sort of issue that's coming up. It's trying to take a step back from well, arguably the human nature approach of thinking about it in your own interest, to actually thinking about the bigger picture and the group interest that's there. I mean, let's just take within the pandemic, for example, the whole notion of wearing a mask. I think it's much more politicized in the US than it is, say, here in the UK. But that kind of notion of you've been asked to wear a mask because it's protecting you, but more so it's protecting those around you.
Yes.
And I think whilst I appreciate there are exemptions to that, the principle, I think, is the idea that there's an expectation that you should be thinking of others as well as yourself.
Yes.
And I think this whole pandemic is starting to show how, as much as we want to say that we're looking out for everybody around us, ultimately everybody still just thinks about themselves. And I think that's more apparent in some places than others. And I'm not saying that everybody's in that space, but I think these very dramatic examples of life confronting you is really when you start to see where people are and what sort of power there is in a collective approach versus an individual approach. And when you look at things like taking it back towards the Black Lives Matters movement, that's grown, it's been around for the last 7 years, but the momentum that's there comes from the strength of a collective voice. It comes from the strength of people kind of banding together and using the resources around them to really take on that challenge and push back what has been a norm for so long. If one person was trying to do that, nothing's gonna shift. And often I think people, when they're trying to get into that space of jumping into change, I think you of course think of, well, what am I gonna do? I'm only one person. But when you try and, rather than having the change sit with you, if you think about it from the perspective of the change that you're trying to achieve, it then becomes a lot less daunting and a lot less of a personal connection, because you're taking the actions and steps that you want to take because you're contributing to that change you're hoping to achieve. It's not about you as a person, yes, but the role you have in that change you're trying to get to.
Right. Gosh, lots of food for thought there.
Lots of existential comments there.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to listen to this again and and think about it, let alone anyone watching this. Because those are some important questions. I think they're really quite important things to think about. And I mean that goes quite deep, doesn't it? And I suppose it also talks to what's the role of a company and a leader in that context as well. What's their social responsibility, perhaps, in contributing to that discussion, to that progress, right? So achieving progress, and they are the right questions to be asking. And I, personally, I think boards should be leading that discussion within their organisation. And my personal feeling is I don't think those discussions are happening enough. But and there's a real sort of everything that's happened this summer, and with the pandemic, with the discussion around Black Lives Matter, and presents a real opportunity to do things differently. And I sometimes, think that actually those who are waiting for getting back to normal are waiting for those discussions to pass so we can just get on with things, and that for me is a big no-no, because you're not really addressing the fundamentals there.
Totally.
So,
and it's better, just to finish, and for those who are waiting for those conversations to pass, those are the exact people who benefit from the system as it currently is. So they're not, eager and chomping at the bit to be able to look at that and address it, and see what sort of opportunities lie on the other side by creating a new kind of way of being and system, because the current, well, I'm going to call it previous system, has worked so well for them. So why are they going to rock the boat when it's benefiting them? I think those who are trying to rock it have either acknowledged that they have benefited from it and now want to try and shift things so that everybody can benefit from it, along with those who've never benefited from it and are trying to say, we've been trying to tell you this for so long, and now maybe you started listening to us.
Yes.
So yeah.
Gosh, so much happening. The world is really interesting place right now. I mean, it is all the time, but I suppose it's looking at it from a different perspective. So, in your opinion, what is the ideal workplace culture that takes workers' rights seriously? Because for me, it's about bringing it back to the way organizations work, the way they listen, the way they process, the way they systemize, all of those sorts of things. So what does that ideal workplace culture look like in that case?
So for me, I think the ideal looks like a workplace that has a strong communication model, where the culture of the workplace is founded on trust, where, if your employees feel valued, protected, and are paid an actual living wage, then the result of that is a healthy, productive, and efficient workforce.
Yes.
This approach doesn't have to just stop within your own operations, but if you're operating in a system where you work with supply chains, that your organization is contributing and fostering a partnership approach with your suppliers rather than a kind of top-down expectation approach. That you're, within an organization, that you're leading by example, that you're providing support where needed, that you're encouraging a culture and understanding where things such as the rights to freely associate and collectively bargain are encouraged, not forced. It's a space to grow in rather than being punished. That, having that strong communication model can take a lot of forms. It can look like, workers joining and or starting a trade union within the workplace. It can look like working with management and freely elected worker committees and employee forums. I think the important thing is that there is a space for workers in management to speak in a way that isn't kind of stifled or a little suggestion box on the side of the office. There's a real kind of space for growth and opportunity there. And I think what's important is that there's that connection is that it's supported by constructive dialogue. It's right. Supported by things like having feedback loops, so that when issues are raised and addressed, both either positively or negatively, that people feel it's worth their time. If I go and raise something with whether it's my HR manager or with my worker representative and nothing comes up, I don't even hear what's coming about from that. Why am I going to say something? It's just gonna fall on deaf ears. I think what's often missing in any kind of workplace is people are very quick to create the mechanisms to have those kind of conversations, but then everybody seems to forget about how you tie off those conversations, how you provide remedy and actually actually gives, you know, this a solution may not be possible, but at that time, if at all, however, maintaining that conversation and explaining why it is that something can't happen is something that is so often missed. And I think that's when it comes to when I'm thinking of an ideal workplace, regardless of sector, country, anything else, it's that kind of foundation of workers and management feeling like they can interact with one another in a positive way. And even if challenging things are brought up from either side, that it's being met with a conversation rather than defensiveness or being let go or whatever the case may be.
I've written a couple of things down. I mean, everything you've just said sounds really reasonable, but the things that just come to mind are the create the space for management and workers to engage for growth and opportunity. And then the bit that you said a bit later was the importance of tying up the conversation. And what I've seen happen in places is where management have created those opportunities or those spaces to listen, right? So there's a forum where, like a staff forum type thing, and you know, there's representatives in that forum from the staff, different grades. Perhaps they come with their questions because they've canvassed their colleagues about questions, and they bring those questions to that forum. And then you have a representative, perhaps from the management team, who are sitting there to listen. And I've seen that up to that point, it sounds really good. The bit I think that worries me is when we don't tie up those conversations, and actually we're now, you know, demonstrating we're not listening to the work to those questions, or actually just feels it feels superficial,
tokenistic.
Yes, completely tokenistic, and not worthwhile. And I think this then talks to sort of the challenges leaders face, because there's an element of, because we talked about the corporate governance code, right? So there's a governance requirement to listen to your workforce voice. So we then end up risking putting in tick box activities like, yeah, we've got the forum, tick. They actually meet monthly or quarterly or whatever it is, tick. So it comes back to the nuance of that, doesn't it? So how do organizations, how do leaders, you know, what are the solutions to this? Because I'm hearing they need to listen better, but actually they don't really, do they? I mean,
so I think they do need to listen better, but listening better means acting on what you've heard. Yeah. So I think for me, what would a solution that would kind of come about in this space is obviously creating the space or creating the mechanisms to foster those conversations is one step, absolutely critical. You can't do the rest of them if you don't have that. Yeah. Kind of what's the follow through? Right. What sort of kind of system can be put in place? You know, different operating systems within a business that formalize what's going to happen. It formalizes, you know, if you're going to have worker representatives and representatives from management, that, you know, yeah, not only is it that, as an example, that they have kind of monthly meetings to speak to one another and share what's going on. So I think, just to finish my point, it's in formalizing those processes that you bring accountability to the conversation. Yeah. And in formalizing those processes, that includes things like at your quarterly board meeting, you have an agenda point where you talk about what's going on the shop floor. I think the other thing to bear in mind is, in any sort of recommendation of how to look at this piece around kind of worker management dialogue is you can't just say, oh, we're going to do it, and then, you know, have an election and see what happens. The company has to be prepared to provide the relevant kind of resources and training on their side in terms of their leadership, but also for those people who are, whether it's the representative on the board or worker representatives in the workplace, there has to be an adequate kind of space for resources to enable people to do their jobs properly. So you can't have, you know, a representation of workforce with somebody who doesn't know how to do that. And I think it's not fair to kind of put that on them and say, well, we tried, but it didn't work. Well, yeah, because the person didn't know what they were doing. They wanted to do it, and that's why they put themselves forward and people voted for them. But if you haven't provided them with the time off to learn, the training to learn, and the opportunity to kind of have time within their workday to engage with workers and get that information, then it's all irrelevant. So I think it's making sure that to foster this kind of conversation, everybody in the conversation has to be prepared to be involved, and everybody has to be able to be provided with the relevant kind of training and support to be able to take on that role properly.
Yeah. Again, lots of things to think about. So are there any kind of other solutions that you would recommend for leaders, you know, to address some of the challenges that we've talked about?
I think what I've just been describing is the ideal. And whilst there are a lot of organizations who are taking significant steps to get to this place, I think the majority have quite a long way to go, in my opinion.
Yeah.
In terms of an organization having someone like me in terms of expertise, I think it's not so much somebody in like me or in my role, but rather it's more how, you know, how many organizations have someone in the space to explore how to look at things from a human rights perspective and how that can be applied in the business. One thing is kind of adding something on to somebody's role and saying, oh, we want you to look at human rights, or we want you to look at ethical trade. Another thing is to hire a human rights manager or hire an ethical trade manager whose only job is to look at that. And I think steps like that show the seriousness of where a company is. That it's not just that. Obviously, if you hire one person and expect them to clean up the mess of everybody else, then that's not really very, you know, encouraging to that person. But it's a step that you've kind of acknowledged that we can't just add it on to somebody else's job. We have to have at least someone, if not ideally a team, to be able to look at this all the time, because they're experts in the space and they're the ones who can help guide us on this journey. And I think, you know, often I think often there's a bigger gap than there should be between the likes of, say, what human rights means and for example, the role that you know, HR and human resources has in that space, that they shouldn't be kind of working against each other, but rather they're complementary kind of subjects that go together. And I think, you know, within that, it's important to be focused on solutions and thinking about what steps can be taken to achieve a positive outcome and address any risks that may come up in that process. But I think within that, often a company, you know, kind of, I think where the difference lies is that when people think about risk, often people are always thinking, what's the risk to my business?
Yes.
But actually, if you shift that on its head and say, well, what's the risk towards the people that I'm connected to, both within where I work and within those who are connected to where I work, then that moves the actions to be focused on kind of what can we do to do better. So I think in addressing how it moves forward, taking on a human rights kind of due diligence approach rather than a normal company due diligence approach, i.e. moving from a focus on people rather than a focus on risk to business, that the difference between operating in the status quo versus taking active steps to contribute to society through your company's actions, that's where you start to see the leaders come through. And whilst I don't think anybody has it right, there are companies, I think, in the space who you can see have really taken on what does that mean and looked at things both internally as well as what they can do externally and the influence that they have. And the more that companies, not just big companies, but obviously they're going to pave the way, the more that, you know, the private sector can acknowledge that they're going to be the ones leading the way. Government absolutely have a role in this. And I think under the, you know, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which is around protect, respect, and remedy, there is, you know, a role for government. Absolutely, that can't be ignored. But if we wait for governments to do things, we're never going to get anywhere. So I think it's a kind of complementary approach of businesses are waiting for regulation and government is waiting for business to take a lead. They have to work together and they have to do it in parallel, because if not, nothing's going to move. So I think, you know, there's different bits of legislation that you can see in the world, you know, things like the Modern Slavery Act in the UK is a kind of parallel space of companies needed regulation, but government also needed companies to take a lead. And that's, you know, why things are kind of pushing forward, and the fact that the EU is, you know, hopefully not just talking, but actually going to bring about, you know, kind of mandatory human rights, you know, kind of reporting requirements from next year. Who, you know, we'll have to see how that comes about. But I think those types of things, as long as they're working together, we can start to move things along. But I think we're missing a trick here of the role that companies can really do in this space. I mean, money talks. So
what you just said,
have the power.
With the whole thing about money talks, I think there's the money talks on there's a real financial benefit for organizations to do this and do it properly and meaningfully. Then there's the thinking behind the other side of that coin, which is actually this costs money. So, you know, I'm sure there are leaders out there who think, well, this is just another cost of compliance. This is just another cost to us that's going to affect our bottom line, without really understanding actually it might be a cost of compliance, but there's actually the financial benefit in the long run, right? So there's a bottom line benefit. Yeah,
and I think that's where you'll see the distinction in leaders. You see, you know, short-term investment, long-term gain, versus I don't want to spend any money right now because it's going to affect my bottom line, but then I have to pay even more down the line because I didn't look after my workforce, or I didn't sustainably kind of source from wherever I needed to get to, and now I don't have anything left to be able to do it. I think, you know, that's the whole climate change conversation, you know, in a nutshell, is everybody's trying to argue that you've got to invest now to be able to see the long-term gain, but nobody wants to invest now. And the only ones that are investing now, or have been over the last few years, in the likes of solar energy and alternative fuels and everything else, are already now starting to see the benefits because they decided to take a chance, you know, a number of years ago. And but I would argue in this space, it's not, you know, we're talking about people's lives. And it's frustrating and sad to see that so often so many companies are thinking about their bottom line and how much money they can make, rather than the people that are connected to providing them with that money in the first place. And without those employees or those workers in those supply chains, they don't have a business. So why is disconnect between how much money I make and how I treat people, when if you don't have people and they go, or you've exploited them to nothing, or, you know, there isn't anybody around because there's no kind of labor available, then you don't get to have your business. So why can't these two join up, when it seems like a common point to you and I, but it isn't common sense, because if it was, then we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Gosh, yes, that's very true.
I hope that we can continue to take, you know, the society that we have created because we had to in the last 6 months, that actually is the final kind of push over the edge that we needed to actually start to acknowledge that there's so many systems that currently exist that no longer are fit for purpose. And rather than having, you know, a few here and there saying like, look, we've got to change this business model and change this approach, that we've realized that, you know, it's taken quite literally the whole world coming to a standstill for us to realize that if we continue to operate in the way we have been, what happened this year is not going to be the first thing that happened. It won't be the first. It'll be the first of many to come. And, you know, I think as we're trying to get to the other side, when obviously second waves and potential lockdowns are looming, that, you know, the world has shown that it can't handle doing it again. So all the conversations around, you know, let's take this as an opportunity to not only start fresh, but start fresh in a green way, in a sustainable way, in a different way than what we had before, so that if this comes again, we're much better prepared than what we were to begin with, because we've created more of a safety net across the board than where we are at the moment, which is that the vast majority of people are going to be left with nothing because their jobs just didn't allow them to be able to continue on when this was going on, or now that we've come out to the other, at least in this country, come out to the other side without you know, furlough being an option anymore, and now nobody has any jobs and there aren't any jobs to go to. So I think it's, you know, it's a bigger conversation, but I think my last point would just be, remember that, you know, we all have successes because of the people around us, so let's try and look out for one another.
And that's an amazing thing to end on, to be honest with you. I think that's, let's leave it there. That was a conversation I suspect we could carry on and on and on about, because there's so many different nuances to explore. And I really enjoyed that. Thank you, Alessa. Learned so much through that conversation with you, and lots to take away and to think about. So I think that's, we can call this one a great conversation. Thank you for doing this interview with me, and really appreciate your time this morning, and the ideas and experience knowledge you've shared this morning. That was brilliant. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you for having me.